Internal relations in the West have been breaking down rapidly in recent days. The United States is no longer sending signals that its foreign policy is clearly anchored in the effort to maintain the unity of its allies and the stability of the existing order. On the contrary, statements and actions coming from Washington suggest a fundamental change in approach. American President Donald Trump openly admitted that after not receiving the Nobel Peace Prize, he no longer feels obligated to think exclusively about peace. This sentence alone represents a significant shift in the rhetoric of the head of state who leads the most important Western power. However, it's more than just a figure of speech. Alongside the long-standing pressure on Denmark regarding Greenland, another even more serious issue is coming to the forefront. Canada is also starting to appear more and more often in Trump's statements and actions. A large Western country, a key ally of the United States, and a NATO member. What originally seemed like an isolated dispute over an Arctic island is now expanding into a broader conflict within the West itself. The developments of recent days suggest that this is not a random deviation, but rather a gradual expansion of the range of targets of American pressure. And in this context, Canada appears to be another significant point that is beginning to attract Washington's attention. In recent days, Canada has started to appear in American rhetoric in a completely new context. Not as an obvious ally, but as a country whose strategic vulnerability is being openly named. Donald Trump repeatedly suggests that Canada is not able to secure the protection of the northern region and the Arctic on its own, especially against Russia and China. These statements come at a time when Washington is also increasing pressure on Greenland and Denmark. These two lines together form a clear picture. The United States is increasingly open about the need for firm control of the northern regions, from the Arctic territories all the way to the North American continent. In this framework, Canada shifts from being just a partner to becoming a space whose security concerns the United States. Naturally, these signals do not go unanswered. The Canadian government is beginning to openly talk about the need to strengthen its military presence in the Arctic and to become more actively involved in allied security activities. At the same time, there is growing concern that the dispute over Greenland may not remain an isolated episode, but could become a precedent for broader pressure on other allies. It is in this context that we should also interpret Canada's growing involvement in European debates about Greenland. Canada is gradually ceasing to act as a distant observer and is beginning to present itself as a country preparing for the possibility that it could itself become the focus of American policy. The change in tone towards Canada is therefore one of the clearest signs that American pressure is no longer limited to a single island or a single country, but is spreading to the very core of Western alliances. The dispute over Greenland has in recent days shifted from the level of political statements to open tension between the United States and the European Union. What is interesting is that an unorthodox yet isolated idea of Trump is turning into a concrete source of transatlantic conflict. European countries, especially Denmark, are responding to American pressure with a clear rejection. Greenland is an autonomous territory within the Kingdom of Denmark, and its status is non-negotiable. Meanwhile, in Brussels, it's increasingly acknowledged that the dispute extends beyond the island, touching on core Western principles: sovereignty, border integrity, and allied relations. The tension also appears in the economy. The European Union is considering retaliatory measures in response to American pressure and threats, with tens of billions of euros at stake. Meanwhile, talks on a future trade deal between Brussels and the United States are slowing or even being suspended. The dispute over Greenland is thus turning into a broader issue, affecting trade, diplomacy, and security. Canada's stance is also a significant signal of change. Ottawa is considering sending Canadian soldiers to Greenland as part of alliance activities and Arctic exercises. It's officially to support allies and bolster Arctic security, but the move has broader significance. This is the first time Canada is actively getting involved in the dispute that arose between the United States and European parliaments. It's making clear it views the developments as a potential risk to itself. Canadian involvement also underscores that Greenland has become a symbol of a much bigger problem. It's not just about control over a single territory, but about the question of how prepared the Allies are to respond to pressure coming from within the alliance. At this point, the dispute over Greenland becomes a test of Western unity, with consequences reaching beyond the Arctic. The escalation of tensions has also taken on a formal shape in recent days. Donald Trump sent a letter to the Norwegian Prime Minister in which he openly links his dissatisfaction with not receiving the Nobel Peace Prize to a change in his approach to foreign policy. According to Reuters, which has the letter at its disposal, the United States president states in the text that he no longer feels bound by the obligation to think exclusively about peace, although, in his words, it should remain dominant. However, the letter goes well beyond personal frustration. Trump once again emphasizes in it the United States' intention to acquire Greenland and uses language that is extremely unusual in correspondence between allies. He talks about the need for complete and total control over this territory, and at the same time questions Denmark's right to own it. He argues with security risks, especially the threat from Russia and China. It's important to note that this is not an informal statement on social media or a remark from a campaign rally. The letter was distributed through diplomatic channels, and its content was intended for the highest political leaders of the allied country. This makes it an official signal that the United States is ready to pursue its interests in ways that go beyond the current alliance customs. The wording used in the letter also confirms that the pressure on Greenland is neither an improvisation nor a short-term tactic. This is part of a broader mindset in which security, territorial control, and geopolitical interests take precedence over the traditional rules of cooperation between allies. Combined with developments around Canada and Europe's response, the letter clearly shows that the escalation now has not only a political, but also a formally diplomatic dimension. These developments aren't just a sudden impulse. The pressure on Greenland and the increasing hints towards Canada fit into the framework that Donald Trump has already suggested in the past. Questions of Arctic security, control of strategic territories, and dissatisfaction with the functioning of NATO have long been part of his foreign policy rhetoric. Already in previous years, Trump repeatedly questioned whether the United States was receiving adequate compensation from its allies for its security engagement. He criticized the low defense spending of European countries, spoke about the need for a tougher approach toward partners, and suggested that American protection should not be automatic. In this context, Greenland appeared as a strategic point that should remain under the direct influence of Washington. Canada has also faced provocative statements in past trade disputes. At that time, Trump publicly suggested that Canada could become the next state of the United States of America. This was perceived more as political pressure than a real plan. However, today's developments show that some of these ideas are gradually moving from rhetoric to concrete actions and official signals. From this perspective, the current escalation is not a complete surprise for the Allies. Rather, it is the fulfillment of a direction that was already visible earlier, but until now it was possible to dampen it with institutional mechanisms and internal checks. What is changing today is not the ambitions themselves, but the extent to which they are being pursued openly and without diplomatic cover. The ongoing use of this approach makes the current situation especially sensitive. Allies can no longer assume that this is just a temporary deviation or personal style of communication. Signals from Washington indicate a longer-term shift in how the United States defines its interests toward its own partners. The developments of recent days show that the dispute over Greenland and the growing tension with Canada can no longer be seen as isolated episodes. This is a broader shift in how the United States, under the leadership of Donald Trump, approaches its own allies. The pressure, which for many years was mainly directed at rivals, is increasingly shifting within the Western Bloc itself. For Europe and Canada, this requires fundamentally rethinking security and alliances. Questions that until recently were considered hypothetical are now becoming the subject of real political and military considerations. Reactions in the form of preparations for retaliatory measures, emergency meetings, or considering a military presence in the Arctic suggest that uncertainty is deepening. Meanwhile, transatlantic relations themselves are evolving. What was built on automatism, predictability, and political trust is coming under pressure from bilateral interests and open pressure. Allies are thus facing a situation in which they can no longer take the stability of the West for granted, but must actively redefine it. These developments are more than just disputes over territories or trade measures. This is a test of how well the West is able to function as a cohesive whole at a time when its internal relations are coming under unprecedented pressure. How the United Relations will respond to this situation will have a long-term impact on the shape of security and political arrangements in the coming years.
Welcome to Beyond Borders. Here, we reveal hidden connections, power dynamics, and conflicts shaping our world.